Welcome back, listeners. It's Josiah Sandoval here. Welcome again to the New Media Lab Peer Review English 102 podcast. I'm joined here today with two very special guests, Lorena Austin and Katie Brown. And with the first podcast, we're going to go over their focus proposal papers and eventual research paper. So I will first introduce Lorena Austin. Hello.
Hello. How are you today?
I'm wonderful. And from what I've talked about with you before the podcast, your topic is on critical race theory in the United States prison system.
Yes.
So let's start with you. And a few questions for you. Can you tell me, just tell me about the topic in general and why you chose that topic?
I think my interest stemmed from a documentary that I'd seen called 13th on Netflix, if anyone's interested. And it talks about the effects and the loopholes created by the 13th Amendment. And while the 13th Amendment, for those who don't know, was the amendment that declared slaves free in this country, it also allowed the loophole for people to be incarcerated very easily. And I know historically a lot of people were worried about, slaves made up most of the workforce in the country at that time, free labor, but also enslavement. And so it became very easy to target blacks in this country for very small crimes, and then in turn they would have to do work. And so a lot of things we see historically, like chain gangs and things like that in movies that we see. So kind of just I wanted to understand context and history is a super important thing to me, and how things, sometimes our past reflects our present. So I really wanted to kind of dive into why things are the way they are in modern day prison systems, how we've kind of evolved from incarcerating people for crimes to turning into, in our judicial system, mandatory sentencing laws. We're the only country in the world that incarcerates more people than educates people, and so it's kind of this. It's a really interesting topic, and there's so many segments to it. But that just kind of fueled my interest in wondering why things are the way they are and how the past reflects our present.
Wonderful. It's a very, very interesting research topic. Now, a question for you: how do you feel historically, when those laws were changed, that they were targeted, and they targeted African Americans?
Yeah, African Americans, and then just people of color in general.
People of color.
And I mean, historically, you can look at, when we had different definitions of race in this country. Even for me, I'm of Mexican American descent, and my grandparents were labeled white on their birth certificates, but still had to endure Jim Crow laws and things of that nature. So not just blacks, but also just people of color in general.
Is this topic do you feel relevant today as it was as much back then?
Absolutely, because I think when we look at our history, when we look at society and how we've portrayed certain people, especially people of color, it has become kind of a normalized thing that we see a large number of African Americans and Hispanics incarcerated. And it's the things that we see, even they talk about the TV show Cops, which was in like the late 80s and 90s, how it mostly portrayed people of color to be maybe angry or something that's genetic, that they're already predisposed to making negative choices that affect them and their fault, but not understanding that these groups of people probably came from lower income, poor housing, because they were not able to advance in the society the way Europeans or whites were in this country. So tying all those things together, education, poverty, and really, really understanding why some of our communities are in the situations that they're in. It's not just because they're predisposed to be this way, because they were never given the luck of the draw in the history of this country.
Very interesting. What kind of goals do you want to portray to the people that are going to read your research paper?
I think just to have a better understanding in general and to look at the history of our country through a different lens. I think if you really look at our public education system, we only tell the European narrative. They say the victor gets to write history, and that's definitely happened in this case. So when you step back and look at the different narrative of communities that aren't reflected in our history, I just really want people to understand there's more to than what meets the eye, and to really take it upon themselves to educate themselves, because I think a lot of times we look for people of color to educate us, or people of different groups to educate us, and they become the sole people. You be kind of like the token person over, you have to educate us, but I think it's really the responsibility of the person to educate themselves as well.
What a wonderful topic. I think it's important not to be so myopic when you see something and you see people of color in the prison system and not understand why historically that could have happened to them. Well, wonderful. Thank you for sharing. We'll come back to you in a minute. As I stated, my other guest is Katie Brown, and from what we talked about, your subject is on fan fiction and its effect on our current generation. So can you please expound on that? And for our listeners that do not know what fan fiction is, can you please explain to them what fan fiction is?
My topic, it's fan fiction. Fan fiction is basically when a fan takes of a certain TV show or book, takes a character or the plot of the said story, and they change it to their own, like what they want to, like they change it into their own story and they post it online. And the reason why I'm doing this as my topic is because it's blown up in the last, since the 60s. It started with like Star Trek, and they would put these like fan fictions in like magazines and stuff like that, and now with the creation of fanfiction.net, it's become this huge thing, a part of like fandom culture, which is something growing in like the 21st century. And it's a big thing with our generation, the past generation. I feel like I talked to my mom about this once, and she's like, I don't even know what fan fiction is. And it's an interesting topic. So
You stated the effect on the current generation, and what effect do you think that is? Is it a creativity aspect, or what is it? What is the effect?
The effect is that usually in like history, when you want to like publish something you've written, you have to pay to have that published. Nowadays, kids can write whatever they want and publish it online, and people can respond and comment that, and it can be a great tool for young writers to practice and to grow without having to pay all this money, and without having to be burned out when no one buys their book, and they don't have to make their living off of it.
So it's a platform for creativity.
Yeah.
For the younger generation. What are some of the things that you want to portray to your audience, or what are your goals for this topic in your research paper?
My goal is to educate people on it, and to say it's a lot more than, like, for example, 50 Shades of Grey was made from like a Twilight fan fiction, and that's basically what most people know about it, and it's much more than that. It's, it's much more, it's more for people. I want to take away the misconception and show that it is a great tool for young writers to grow, and I want to show it positive effect it has on young writers, because I have done research before how it has helped writers improve their writing, on especially their revision process and stuff like that.
And would you agree that also having this sort of open platform, these young writers won't necessarily get discouraged by trying to get published and not being able to get published, but they have feedback on their topic of choice from other people in that community?
Yeah, it's very much with this kind, you publish and you get feedback right back from people that are your age, not older people who don't really get what you're trying to talk about. You can write about issues that people know about, and it becomes an easier way for them to just have their writing out there, and for people to see it, and for them to get feedback to say, oh, okay, this works, but this doesn't work. And sometimes it works, but sometimes a lot of times people don't comment on what they write. So sometimes it works, but there are moments where it does not.
Well, wonderful, Katie. I look forward to reading your research paper once it's completed. We're going to go back to Lorena momentarily. Lorena, can you please let me know if you had any insights on things that you might have read while you've been conducting this research, or things that you have learned or that have changed your mind, or maybe just some interesting facts that you would like to share with me?
Sure. I think one of the biggest pieces of research that I've used was the book called The New Jim Crow by Michelle Alexander. And she basically highlights a new era of colorblindness in connection with the United States judicial system. And it's interesting just the way they see it through a different lens, as a means of perhaps racial control. And so the example in the very first part of the book that they give is this young man's name was Javarius Cotton, and his great-great-grandfather could not vote because he was a slave, and his great-grandfather could not vote because he was killed by the Ku Klux Klan when he attempted to vote, and then his own father was intimidated during the Jim Crow era voting, and then he himself could not vote because he is labeled a felon. He was in prison, but he's a felon after being released, and he is not allowed to vote. So it kind of just starts off with that, and kind of just, for me, helped kind of catapult this idea of how maybe race plays a bigger part in the United States judicial system than we think, and also currently today how we have privatized prisons now, where we allow private corporations to run prison systems in our country, and they pay us by filling beds. So it is something that is kind of seems so backwards that we need to have the beds filled, and so it kind of in my mind can further increase someone's opportunity to become in prison so easily, because there's pressure on these corporations that are now privatized. They're not even run by our state or local governments anymore. So it's a really interesting way to see how we've transformed prisons into money making, and not by providing maybe enough resources for mental health or education. In other countries, we have Sweden. Sweden was interesting that they are actually having to close down some of their prisons because they provided so much rehabilitation, both mental education, etc., and drug rehabilitation. So it really goes to show how if we could shift the way we think about our prison system, how we could positively impact our country.
Well, I agree with you. The term, correctional systems kind of speaks that something is going to be corrected. I don't think that, everybody that goes into prison does not deserve an opportunity to live a normal life free of whatever it was that got them in there. And the recidivism rates, as I'm sure that you've been reading about, are sometimes very high. And like you said, that it could be because in prison it's more of a bed space kind of mentality, or how are we going to get more prisons to fill these, instead of how can we educate these inmates, how can we change these inmates and correct these inmates' behavior so they can be functional members of society, and then not have to pay all these taxes on these prisons. And that was a really good analogy of those other countries that you had stated, that they're actually having to close down prisons, and I'm sure when they're closing down prisons, crime is dropping as well. So
right.
Maybe that's something that is something that I look forward to hearing in your research paper. That's all the time we have today, listeners. Thank you, Katie, and thank you, Lorena, for your time here today, and I look forward to reading both of your research papers. And until next time, we are signing out.